you mentioned earlier, if there's a known political war or political injustice or genocide, therefore it may be easier to accept, or actually there's a media appearance that there's a war in Iraq, and then they're asking the politicians, how many refugees are you accepting from Iraq? But then let's say some people who are rightfully asking for refugee asylum from India, because there's no active war maybe known there, they're not accepting it. So do you think that politics also has an impact on maybe those central countries on how many refugees, asylum seekers they would take?
Yeah. So that dynamic of how high profile is a conflict plays in to things, of course, because if it's on the news every day and it's completely undeniable that there's like a huge and violent civil war or foreign invasion or something going on, or say Britain is involved in invading Iraq and it's on the news every day, and then you can't say, oh, nobody from Iraq is really an asylum seeker. So you would be accepting high numbers. Say around 2005, people from Iraq were really highly likely to get asylum in the UK if they'd applied. But then at a point at which you want to represent Iraq as a safe place that's all been sorted out, then suddenly the numbers will go down. The situation for Syrians is like that in the UK at the moment. It's a frozen, like freezing, waiting to see, like basically saying we won't be assessed any more of these claims because people can go home. And so those things play into it in about those nationalities, but also how right-wing, how anti-immigration, what the kind of politics around that is in a country also shapes not just between nationalities, but between countries for the same nationality. You can have very different. So even though it's meant to be an international refugee system with clear criteria, in one country, it might be much more likely that you would be recognised with the same evidence than in another country. So France, for example, has very low recognition rates for lots of nationalities, that in the UK there would be a high chance of somebody being recognised as a refugee.
Overall, would you say that does the EU policy for dealing with refugees and asylum seekers actually work? We're seeing an increase in the number of people coming from Africa and Asia. And then we've already talked about the challenges of frontier countries versus central countries, and voluntary taking in refugees versus maybe even mandatory, some countries taking in refugees. I know part of your work we were talking about just before is, are we asking the right questions? Are we thinking about this in the right way? Could you maybe even give me some insight on what is maybe a better way to actually assess or deal with this?
Yeah, so I suppose on the theme of different questions, one thing is, this is an interesting question. Are there more people? Are there more refugees now? And if you look at the proportion of refugees in the world compared to the world population, over time, since the middle of the 20th century, there has not been a dramatic increase in the number of refugees proportionate to the world population. And the number of refugees ebbs and flows with massive conflict. Like if you look at a graph, you see, oh, there's Ukraine. Oh, there's the Iraq war. You kind of see these ebbs and flows of different numbers. I think it's definitely true that that arrivals have become more visibilized. So as you introduce border controls and make much more strict border controls, then you mean that it's illegal for a group of people to travel who could have travelled before, and so they take an irregular route. You will try and stop them from taking that irregular route and put up some new rules, some new barrier, some bigger fence, and so they have to take another route. And as you go along, those routes become more risky, more dangerous, and more visible. So that's the case in the Channel, and we can talk about that. And so, the Channel's a good example, actually, because we don't have more people crossing the Channel now than we did before, but we see them, they're there. And so then they're in small boats, they're not hidden in lorries. they're not clandestine, they're visible to the media, and so they're visible to you and I, even though we don't live on the Kent coast.
Yeah.
And so then that becomes something that is much more visible and a highly politicized issue. And so then it feels that it's a crisis. So we manufacture a crisis to be seen to solve a crisis, which, so I guess that's one part of the answer of like, what should the EU do? Because there's more refugees than ever before. Like there aren't, of course. And until Ukraine, it'd been a really long time since Europe was actually facing a mass internal refugee crisis at the scale that it faced in the middle of the 20th century. Yeah. And then the Syrian crisis was like the first test, I guess, of the massive test of that post-war regime. Yeah. And we can see how differently Syria was responded to Ukraine, for example. But what should they then do is not, I think, like a small answer or like a one part question. We talked about this a little bit before we started talking, before we started recording, but I think what you should do depends on what you want to achieve, and governments don't, all of the things that you might think you want to achieve aren't compatible with each other. And so you can't simply you can't stop people from coming. People will carry on coming.
Yes.
Irrespective of what you do. But you can't keep making a lot of effort to show you're going to stop them from coming, and which is constantly driving them to more dangerous and risky routes, and simultaneously say that you will centre human dignity and human rights. If you were centering human dignity and human rights, you wouldn't be making it so you can only risk drowning the Mediterranean in order to arrive, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, if you wanted a kind of middle road where you respected human rights and had a moderate control of your borders, then you would uphold the conventions to which you had signed, so a lot of problems are created by underfunding asylum administration systems. So then you have large numbers of people waiting in really squalid conditions and unable to get legal advice. You would just fund that system so that it was not in crisis, so that people could have their human rights recognised and make an application and have it assessed. So there's many different things that you could do, and it depends on what your priority is.
So to try and build on that, from my understanding, is it's what should be at the centre of policy. Is it actually, well, what we think it should be is following the Geneva Convention, which is providing human rights to everyone who is trying to seek refugee or asylum status. And then from there, trying to create policy or organizations to actually work towards those goals. But are you maybe saying that actually that's not at the center? That maybe at the center it's being skewed with political motivation, media influence, maybe even elections as well?
Yeah, so it's 100% driven by politics now, not by solving anyone's problems or realizing anyone's human rights.
Right, okay then. So then that's challenging at the end of the day, because that's what we would like it to be. And maybe yourself, who's researched this field for a long time, you think that's what policy should be. So I guess, why do you feel politicians maybe don't quite put that at the center of their policy making? Are they rightfully or wrongfully doing it? Because politicians, I feel at the end they're there to represent the people and what the people are interested in. So then the question is, are people actually not as interested in maybe not saying following the Geneva Convention, but what was at the heart of it? I guess, why do you feel politicians are skewed in different directions? Is it financially they're skewed away from it?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because it's, why is it an issue that most of the public would care about? So most people will never meet anyone who has applied for asylum.
Yeah.
They do not live anywhere near a border zone. They have no access to this issue or knowing that it's particularly an issue, aside from hearing about it in the media. So I think sometimes we misunderstand. Politicians tell us all the time that they do what people, like, they're democratically elected, and so they just have to do what people want. But they also play a really strong role through the media and alongside the media in shaping people's concerns and worries and preferences. And so it's very difficult then to start to have a conversation about, is the administrative system well funded enough that the number of applications can just be assessed, or kind of look at any element of it rationally. So there's no way for all of these people to apply for asylum in the UK except by travelling across the channel in a small boat. Yeah. So what's the best way to stop them travelling in small boats? Provide some legal advice or means by which they could navigate this administrative system. It's nothing really to do with us living here in Sheffield.
Yes.
But and so I don't believe that the policies are responsive to public demand outside of that demand being produced by the discourse.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that in this period of neoliberal capitalism in crisis that we're in now, where the economic model has produced widening inequality, has produced a growing number of people in precarious jobs, in poverty, with precarity going up the income scale, with middle-class people even finding that they can't live the life they expected, or their children might not have the social mobility that they had in their lifetimes. With all of this slipping back, what does capitalism need to sustain itself as a model? It needs differentiation, and it needs to pit people against each other so that we don't challenge the system. And so I think identifying folk devils or people who are to blame, and we need to pour our ire into them, and if we can just make them go away or get rid of them, then things are going to be better. I think that is a massive part of the political discourse, that kind of scapegoating and distraction. So that's what I meant earlier when I said, let's manufacture the crisis. So the policy and the bordering produces the irregular migration. From the point at which the Channel Tunnel opens and people are trying to walk through the tunnel, you do more and more bordering, you have infrared detectors and CO2 detectors and giant X-ray machines that lorries go through, and all kinds. You spend billions and billions on border controls so that people can't really stow away, and now they're driven into the boats. So you produce the crisis of the boats, and then you have to be seen to solve the crisis. But you've produced the thing where there's this, you're now telling people, this invading force, these invading people, they're nothing to do with us if we don't stop them. And it's like a really good narrative, I think, politically, to
seem to be attacking, create a crisis, or...
And none of those people, since most of us will never meet people across the channel, and most of the people across the channel aren't voters, you kind of can't, there's so much political value to be extracted from this, that I think it's, we're asking about kind of democracy and whether politicians should just respond to what people want. I think it's a more complex role that this issue plays in politics and in the politics of what we choose to identify as a problem,